Greetings, students, and welcome to Complexity Fuel. My name is Mr. Little, and I am looking at a map of the grand scale and size of the Mongol Empire. Now, a lot has been said and a lot has been written about the Mongol Empire, and so it's really hard to make it complex, but I'm going to try. So with that said, let's go ahead and get started. When it comes to AP World, what do you actually have to know about the Mongols and their empire? 1, the Mongol Empire and how it functioned. 2, the Mongol Empire's promotion of trade. And 3, the spread of culture and technology facilitated by the Mongol Empire. With that said, let's make things a little more complicated, shall we? So first, let's talk a little bit about the climate. So it seems like every year we get an interesting article about how some empire or some great event in history was actually impacted by the environment, right? And this one in particular from a couple years back talks about how the Mongol Empire basically would not have been possible without a certain climatic condition. Is that the case? Is this all hype? And their argument is basically this. The conquest of Genghis Khan during the 13th century was only possible because of the warm and persistently wet climate. We propose that these climatic conditions promoted high grassland productivity and favored the formation of Mongol political and military power. In other words, no good climate, wouldn't have had as much grass, wouldn't have had as many horses or herd animals, and you wouldn't have been able to get as many Mongols together. An interesting lesson in how human activity is impacted by the environment. Now, the other thing you occasionally see is the other way around, right? There are articles and pieces that talk about how the Mongols and their conquest, the destruction of farmland, caused a climatic shift known as the Little Ice Age, in which for about 500 years, temperatures were on average lower than they had been for the previous 500 years. And the answer for that one is a little less clear, right? Scholars point out that there's a lot of other factors that influence the Little Ice Age, such as the eruption of a volcano in Indonesia that spewed tons of CO2 into the atmosphere, localized famines around the world that would periodically remove farmland from rotation, as well as sunspots that could affect the annual average temperature. And so the question of whether humans can impact the environment by their actions in a pre-industrial world is a little less clear than the question of can the environment impact human activity. With that said, let's talk a little bit about the Mongols and trade. So we often like to say that the Mongols made the Silk Road flourish, right? They built caravansaries along the Silk Road to encourage caravans to visit. They also had a system of passports known as the Yam System, which guaranteed safety and security along their road. But in building all of that, it's worth noting that the rise of the Mongol Empire had led to an incredible amount of destruction across Central Asia. Pre-Mongol cities that had been centers of trade and centers of commerce, such as Gurganj, Balkh, Nishapur, Merv, were completely destroyed, burned to the ground. Their citizens slaughtered, merchants slaughtered, libraries burned. It was pretty bad. And although, you know, one of the things I've often wondered is maybe the reason the Mongols had to build all those caravansaries and promote that Yam system was because they had destroyed the existing network of trade. They destroyed the existing network of city, foreshadow what was going to happen to Baghdad along the way. So it's worth remembering that building an empire, very, very violent. But I can hear you saying, what about the Pax Mongolica, right? That peace that persisted for 100 years or more after the Mongol Empire, right? Surely that was worth it. Well, was there a Pax Mongolica? The historian and scholar S. Frederick Starr doesn't think so. He points out that within 20 years of the death of Genghis Khan, his descendants were already at war with one another. Quote, the fractious state of Mongol relations force us to disregard the popular notion of a Pax Mongolica that prevailed across Eurasia. Basically saying there wasn't really one. And I think it's interesting, right? We talk about a couple of their famous pacts is Pax Romana, the Roman peace, Pax Britannica, right? The British Empire in the late 1800s. But even when empires were at their height, they were often waging foreign wars or dealing with internal revolts. And that's the thing about a pax anything, you know, it raises some questions about, is empire inherently peaceful? It's something to think about. But hang on, I can hear you saying again, Mr. Little, I know the story of Marco Polo, and he went to Asia at least 2 times. Clearly that means Pax Mongolica must have really been a thing, right? Well, as Frederick Starr again kind of comes out and points out that even though Marco Polo did go between Europe and China 2 times, right? Marco Polo didn't just go straight across Central Asia. He went a more southern route. And this, S. Frederick Starr is pointing out that in the center of Asia, what's now like Central Asia, parts of Russia, were at war during the time of Marco Polo's journeys. And therefore, he had to go a very particular southern route through Iran and then directly into China. And then on the way back, he had to take a boat because it wasn't safe to go over land. And so this all kind of calls into question the concept of a Pax Mongolica. Domestically, within their individual Mongol empires, they faced a lot of difficulty. You might remember that the Chinese had developed the world's first paper money in the Sung dynasty, and their successor, the Yuan dynasty, also continued to use paper money, in part because they never came up with an alternative to the use of paper money. And the Mongol dynasty's paper money is known as Diaochao, and they dealt with the exact same problem that the Sung dynasty had dealt with, which was rapid inflation. And that creates a great deal of instability, and in part contributed to the Red Turban Revolt, which would topple the dynasty after about 100 years of rule. And the Ilkhanate, that is the Mongols who ruled in Persia, also attempted to adopt paper currency in 1294. This was quickly abandoned. The historian Rashid al-Din, who wrote the Chronicle of the Ilkhanate, described the paper money saying, quote, "The ruin of Basra, which was a major trading center in what is now Iraq, which ensued upon the spread of the paper money." So basically saying paper money, it completely wrecked major trading centers because nobody wanted to take it, right? It was considered worthless, and it was very quickly abandoned. How quickly it was adopted is another interesting story, because literally the Ilkhanate's paper money was almost identical to the Jiaochao of the Yuan dynasty. The only difference was at the very bottom, they added the Muslim profession of faith to indicate that this was the Ilkhanate, which had embraced Islam, and not the Yuan dynasty. But the Mongol lettering, the Chinese lettering, all that stayed the same. So it's interesting. We talk about Mongols spreading technology across the world. Well, paper money is one of those things. So how can we use all of this? How can we talk about all this? Well, if you get an essay about building an empire, how destructive and damaging the creation of empire could be an element to throw into your essay. You could talk about how financial struggles can shape political fortunes. It's not always just rise of empires, great men, military victories, and grand strategists. Sometimes your finances determine the fortune of your state. If you have an essay that asks how the environment can shape human activity and human endeavors, then bringing up the case of the Mongols being able to form their empire because of favorable climatic conditions would be a great way to add a little bit of complexity to your essay. Hey there. Thanks so much for watching. I hope this video was able to help you. If you appreciate this kind of work, please like and subscribe. And of course, I welcome any kind of feedback or suggestions, so feel free to leave a comment down below. Thanks so much for joining me. I'm Mr. Little, and I'll see you next time.